So I won't go too much into all the formalities. This is a chapter coming out in a book edited by Hekai. It's going to come out of the University of Michigan Press. And mine is more like an international relations scholar's take. I'm not a big expert on China, but I'm going to say a few things as I understand the rise of China, a phenomenon that is happening as we speak. And the international relations scholars are actually, just like the policymakers are trying to figuring out China's rise is a big challenge. There's a lot of debate among different schools of thoughts, whether China is a realist state, China is a liberal state, China is a constructivist state. Those who are not in international relations, these are not important, but for us it is. But anyway, I'm trying to say is that this is partly because China has adopted two of the three components of liberal international order: economic interdependence and international institutions. The third one is democratic peace. So these are the three pillars of what you call the Kantian peace or liberal internationalism. And so this is part of the confusion, whether China is pursuing a typical realist path or a liberal path with a realist connotation. Is China trying to become a hegemonic power and renew or bring back the whole so-called tributary system of yesteryears? And then there is a big question, what kind of a normative order will China bring once it becomes the so-called hegemon? So as you know that after a period of keeping a low profile and peaceful rise strategy, President Xi Jinping in 2012 onwards starting to talk about first G2 involving the United States. Now there is some conversation, although debated, that China would like to be numero uno or number one, and that the decline of the Western powers, the United States, is likely to happen. Although it is couched in very normative terms, there is some consideration that China's rise is inevitable. China is going to be the key player in the Asia-Pacific arena. And the Belt and Road Initiative is perhaps the cleverest manifestation of this initiative. And I do think that this is a major challenge for all states. It's very unique that a rising power has come up with something of this nature, resurrecting an old idea, but with a lot of new connotations. So my contention is that China has to go carefully. China has done quite a bit to go carefully, but even further. So this is sort of a position I'm taking, that China should not get into the Thucydides Trap that Graham Allison has recently written, which is not totally improbable. The Thucydides Trap, as you know, the conflict between Athens and Sparta that is described well in the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides, that the declining power would be tempted to arrest the rising power. Now, China has done quite a bit to prevent that from happening. But I think the problem is sometimes China or any rising power can read too much from history or historical analogies and try to use that strategy. One historical analogy that China should try to avoid is Germany's rise. Germany during the period of early 20th century or slightly before that. Bismarck was very clever, thought he could come up with a strategy to build up Germany, become a world power, but then the Kaiser and team decided to fire him and put into a position of sudden quick advancement, which is potentially the most dangerous thing the temptation leaders tend to have. Why I'm saying that, many leaders think the time is finite, there is time pressure. You need to get there in my lifetime. Okay, this is a problem Hitler faced, obviously, but I'm not saying that Xi is in that position, but the temptation is there a little bit. So the international order that what we see today is very much in flux, and the question is whether the kind of systems that international scholars talk about, a balance of power system, hegemonic stability system, or a concert system, or any of the liberal international order systems that will emerge in Asia Pacific. So I want to talk a little bit about defining international order because this concept is very important to for various reasons. So this is a concept that has been debated in our field, international relations. Hedley Bull has this famous book, The Anarchical Society, where he talks about it as order as a pattern of activity that sustains the elementary or primary goals of the society of states or international society. It's a problematic definition because its pattern of activity is not what I think is order should be, but it is indeed, as Eikenberry calls, the organizing principles, authority relations, functional roles, shared expectations, and settled practices through which states do business. So essentially, order is a state of affairs, and the critical question is whether order for whom? Order is a pattern, but it's also a state of affairs where states live in stability or instability or war or peace. So an orderly society, orderly international system is where change takes place peacefully and in orderly fashion. Stanley Hoffman talks about order as a concept that people live together relatively well and prosper simultaneously. Now that is sort of the world order concept. International order is very much a kind of realist, now English society scholars also talk about it. The distribution of power or the management of international order often is in the hands of great powers. And often the systems are created at the end of a world war or a big war kind of situation. And then the question is how long that order will last. So in our discipline, there is this notion of power transitions, power cycles, all are discussed, and I won't go into detail and bore you into it. Some are very trivial, the debates that we have. But Mr. Allison's Thucydides Trap has reignited this problematic a lot powerfully than other IR scholars have. Order can be stable, peaceful, violent, or in between. And domestic politics matters because turbulence in domestic systems can encourage leaders or states to engage in a particular set of behavior. Order can be liberal, partly liberal, and if you look at the Cold War system, you had a partly liberal international order, but 1/3 of humanity was under the communist order, which was not liberal in any sense. The other question is whether international order emerges automatically or do leaders and countries have to create this order. A lot of people believe, including Eikenberry, the name I mentioned, order has to be created, or the post-war order. So in his world, it's the United States that created this order after World War II, and that the world order is based on a set of constitutional type arrangements among the different states that constitute the American hegemony. The regional order is another subcategory of this concept of order. Regional orders are created through conflict cooperation and institutional patterns and rules and regulations of regional interactions, especially among the major states of a region. So regional orders matter because some regions matter more than others. And as we know, Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific, some people don't like the term. I'm going to use it anyway. I'm for Indo-Pacific because historically, if you look at the last 500 years, it has been Indo-Pacific. But during the Cold War, it tilted. So anyway, and China's actions in the Indian Ocean make it automatically Indo-Pacific, even if China doesn't like that particular term. So this region of Indo-Pacific, sub-region, is very important for international order because it's going to determine, unlike previous historical periods, it was Europe that determined world order. Today, it is Asia-Pacific to a great extent. Of course, the Europeans won't be very happy with that statement. Now, the question is, who will be the next hegemonic leader, if at all there is a hegemony? And that's where China comes into the picture. Now, my paper is actually a sort of a critique of the so-called Tianxia, or I may not be pronouncing it right. I asked a couple of people, and they all said, I'm getting closer. But anyway, it's a tribute system, tributary model, and Westphalian model, which is independent states, independently living with sovereignty as the key concern. There is also an American model of Tianxia, which they claim, especially with respect to the hemisphere where United States controls or claim to control quite a bit. Chinese concept is very much philosophical too, as those who have, I've read some of this material, and there's a lot of discussion of the notion of all under heaven, implies that peripheral states accept Chinese suzerainty, paying tributes to the emperor and who acts as son of heaven and reciprocates them with lavish gifts. So, in fact, I was at a conference for this book I mentioned, and there were 3 Taiwanese scholars who all of them wrote about this subject, which surprised me. There were quite a few from China, but they didn't write at all about it. They were very reluctant to even to use this concept. So which wondered why Taiwanese scholars are so into it, which shows that there's something going on in that process. So anyway, the problem for China is that it is confronting a very Westphalian world, because even the tiny Maldives like to be independent. When the European powers are roaming around this region, they didn't have to face that problem, although people forget that the Europeans did not win all the wars they fought, by the way. But eventually they did and managed to acquire a massive amount of territory. So this idea of adapting this particular model is very much problematic. And I have been reading a little bit on David Kang's book, which I think you probably know. He's perhaps the most eloquent supporter, or I don't know now, but when he wrote it, obviously, he came across as quite a supporter of the system. The question is, there are a lot of questions. In fact, it is good to read upon it, and you see the critiques who have written about historians, the extent of the system, the pervasiveness, and its overall impact, and whether it really was that entire Asia-Pacific was affected or not. Now, you can say whether periods of time it was not that effective, but at times it was. But my contention, in fact, I was chatting with some historians who argue that this notion, even Kang puts forward, that it was so pervasive is very problematic. The larger Indo-Pacific had a lot of other contenders, other civilizations. A Sinic civilization is definitely a dominant one. The Indic civilization, people forget that, had powerful impact during this period. Whether the Delhi Sultanate or the Mughal Empire were not part of this system. You have the Arabic world, Arabic civilization coming into Southeast Asia, of course, before that. The Central Asia, even the Mongols. How do we put them all into this scheme of things? And you realize that we might get something similar in the future too if we push too hard, because they all have their own claims to civilization, what I just said. And that the tribute system has this problem, which is, unless you are a member of the fraternity, which is very much a cultural, ethnic kind of idea, how do you get the so-called barbarian any kind of equality in that position? So the point I'm trying to make is that it is probably better for Chinese leaders, now I'm going to exhort some IR wisdom, not to push this too hard, although it gives them some kind of a thing to rely on. And I do think that it is nothing new in the sense, the Americans use the same lingo in IR theory, actually. Those scholars who study Kindleberger and others, they have this notion of hegemonic stability. It's hegemonic stability theory. Essentially, you need a hegemonic power to open up the markets, provide public goods, currency, capital, etc. And Robert Gilpin has written very powerfully that hegemonic stability is very important. Preponderance of a powerful state preserves peace. It's not balance of power. Now, the Chinese adaptation of this notion obviously has benevolence, morality all attached to it. whereas the Western notions are very much rational, self-interest-based systems. And so superior subordinate relationship is based on economics and ideas of rationality. The hegemon provides economic benefits, security protection, not out of nobleness or generosity, but for its own sake, as order is beneficial for both the hegemon and the subordinate states. So I think both are, the Western or the American version and the Chinese version, are sanitized strategic notions to make the secondary states accept the legitimacy of the hegemonic order. So this is where the problem arises. The sanitized versions could work up to a point, but it may not work, as I said, if you push too hard. And so there's a lot of problems with it, because even Kang's own admission that it's not completely clear the geographic extent of the previous eras, whether the different states of the Southeast Asia period, you had much of an impact. I won't go into all these details and questions about it, but my interest is to argue that some of the Chinese efforts are coming out of probably reading too much of the East India Company example. Now, I may be pushing my luck here a little bit. The East India Company, as you know, we are all sitting here, realized that they were the first multinational, the Dutch actually, then obviously the British, who had a notion of making this part of their empires. And the East India Company is based on also the idea of profit, take the profits, and make indebtedness as part of their strategy. Now, the problem is, there's a little bit of, I'll come to that point in this so-called BRI, but it's not exactly that. I mean, I have to give credit to China for coming up with something quite creative in some sense. China's behavior, on the other hand, in these territorial disputes, shows a hyper-Westphalian state. Now, that is part of the challenge. If it is all Tianxia, then you don't push so hard in this whole South China Sea dispute, or with India or others, where China has Japan to some extent. So this Westphalian order and Tianxia are sort of competitive orders in this, and it's not clear how they can practice both at the same time and convince others that we are not a territorial state as the Westphalian model would expect. My contention is that China is unlikely to reach a US-Soviet-style hegemony, partially because it will not be able to overcome many power centers of Asia-Pacific, and that it will not get the allegiance of most of South Asia, Southeast Asia, although some of the states in Southeast Asia in particular may become kind of dependent on it, and South Asia too, the small states. But there is a big difference between patron-client dependency and in the Tianxia model of accepting the dominance willingly. The Indo-Pacific is not yet ripe for any single power to dominate and create a hegemonic order, as the US did following World War II. People simply forget that the United States defeated thoroughly the opponent, that is Japan. The United States transformed Japan. Then the United States obviously had challengers from the Soviet side, but had this extraordinary fortune that the states in this region used the US economic system and to advance to some extent. So the point I'm trying to raise is that China has to return to inclusiveness, not necessarily in this philosophical sense, but even more than that, that China has already shown that it can be inclusive, BRICS model, the BRICS Bank, and the infrastructure model, etc. I want to talk briefly about the challenges and what their potentials are, and how China will find it very difficult to handle these many challenges in the emerging order. 5 states or groups of primary challenges exist for China to achieve hegemony in Indo-Pacific: United States, India, Japan, Russia, and ASEAN. Now, ASEAN may be the one where China could become partially tributary, because some of the states, as you all know, have played this back and forth. This wedge strategy is working. But even those states I've been trying to read the Philippine statements. Yesterday or day before yesterday, the foreign minister said, we are ready to fight a war or something. This was really interesting. We will go to war if there is China push us too hard, which is not what Mr. Duterte was talking about all this time. So the outside powers that are so-called outside this, how to get them into the Chinese order. In other words, that is a big challenge because China is not the United States. You cannot become a Chinese, at least until now. The United States, you can become an American, go and live there, work there, study there. And that's the thing about liberal order. Of course, Mr. Trump is trying to play with that, but that's another thing. I hope it won't last the Trump era, to be very frank, because he's hurting American liberal order by closing the universities, etc. But the point I'm trying to make is that this is where if China transforms, it has to become a Singapore or Hong Kong in terms of people coming in and becoming part of it. So whether China will do, I doubt it. That's another problem for countries like India too. So concentrated on one's own ethnicity and things like that, it's very hard to attract. Japan too, to some extent. So I mentioned these challenges because these challenges are not probably all that visible sometimes, but they are there. And where does the United States stand? My reading is the United States has misread China's rise to some extent, Clinton period in particular, thinking that somehow this modernization theory, as we study in comparative politics, if you bring market forces, democracy will follow. If you have a middle class, the middle class will turn into freedom. This hasn't happened, and that is now haunting Americans to some extent. But the economic part of it is impressively interdependent, and it has a lot of things going on. But the United States, as you can see, has this tendency to wait a little bit. And this happened to Britain. I mentioned Germany. Germany's rise initially was not provoking that much as the British. But when Germany started building the naval power, the one power that challenged British hegemony, that's when Britain turned against Germany. I'm talking about the early 20th century or just around that time. So the United States is slowly getting there, unfortunately. And if China builds up a huge military strength or fortify these islands that it has occupied, I think the British-German interaction problem would emerge. There's something called time pressure. Time pressure is you don't have much time, let us stop them when they're doing it. That's kind of Thucydides Trap, but I'm believing that it is possible even if it is a limited regional level conflict. And I think the interaction that's starting to build up in the South China Sea, unfortunately, is not telling us, of course, it's not a Thucydides Trap situation yet, but we don't know either party could miscalculate their ability to stop this process or not to stop the process. United States has an advantage. Existing hegemons have friends. China has not too many, whether we like it or not. When I say friends, means that we'll work with this country in alliance format. Japan, India, Australia, several of the ASEAN states, these could really form some form of supporter to the United States if China becomes a threatening state. So this is a challenge that I don't know how China will overcome this problem of territorial state and then this Tianxia state, and how the U.S. behavior China will respond. Now it's building up these islets it has created, but I think it is a very problematic one, how far they can go. For instance, blocking the passage of ships, etc. Even if China is not talking about it, once you have a military base in a particular place, you have a temptation to block certain access to that area. China falls into that, then you may see more escalation. Talked about India. I know a little bit more about India. It's quintessentially Westphalian state, and it believes in the sovereign state system. It was indeed during the colonial period challenged the Western hegemony through the Gandhian approach or whatever, and then Nehru's period through non-alignment or soft balancing, the book that Ralph was mentioning. Non-alignment was a soft balancing approach. trying to stop the great powers from competing too much or conflict in the developing world. Now, there is a Hindu fundamentalism emerging in India that believe in ancient Hindu virtues. Even if they don't win, this idea of Indian nationalism based on civilization, a little bit like China, is emerging. And even if you're not a nationalist, the Gandhians, the Nehruvians, the liberal internationalists, all of them believe in India becoming a strategic center at some point and becoming an important player. They keep saying that GDP growth rate will push India, exaggeratedly, I think, number 2 position, number 1 maybe at some point before the end of 21st century. Some even say 2050. I don't believe it's going to be that easy, but clearly something is going on in the economic arena. So whenever China pushes India, Indian nationalism is becoming a lot more virulent. I notice that whenever there is a conflict, there is a kind of consensus among. Earlier, it was not the case. Remember, the Indian Communist Party split over the 1962 war. They thought that China was doing something good, at least some communists, who actually formed another party and kept saying China is not the aggressor there. So that is not the case today. Hardly any groups within India sympathetic to China's push. And so this is a bad thing for China, because there was a time when China had sympathizers, a lot more than they used to be having today. So the problem is, asymmetric power is something you can challenge hegemony. Now take South Asia. India's efforts to achieve hegemony vis-a-vis Pakistan or other small states have been failures. Impossible to dominate those states, and Pakistan has a very counter-hegemonic strategy using asymmetric means. There is no reason why India should have to accept the Chinese hegemony, and India doesn't have to really do a whole lot because it has the Indian Ocean at this point. China will have to build a lot of capacity in the Indian Ocean, which will push India to do more and probably get into the arms of the United States. So there's a lot of these very tricky situations emerging with respect to the region, and India has now developed a relationship, a soft balancing coalition with Japan and ASEAN, some countries, but not all. So my sense is that India is a reactive power. It's very slow. It's like elephant. It definitely reacts if pushed too hard, that it will become, and there's nothing written that India cannot form an alliance, by the way. India had a quasi-alliance with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and that India has also developing nuclear weapons. And so there is nothing that would prevent India if China pushes too hard. I think, to my mind, the biggest challenge to Chinese hegemony, at least in that part, will remain India, as long as India remains a unified state. There's a conditional argument there. And so China is probably economically now superior, but there could be a time when India could also reach certain level of near parity or something. It doesn't mean that it will be a very society fully developed. It has still pockets that look like worse than sub-Saharan Africa. Its developmental pattern is very problematic. But it has the cream, that is about 10%, that can do a lot of things and develop a strong economy if they want. So my point is that India has trying its own mechanisms, trying to stop this Chinese onslaught in some ways, but it is a process that may pick up speed if China pushes too hard. Japan has little choice but to resist, I think, as long as Japan wants to be an independent state. The Japanese psyche is one that does not accept hegemony easily. Now we can say the Americans had a hegemonic order. That is after defeating them completely, transforming them. And they had a pact where Japan was allowed to develop its own ways without spending too much on defense. So Japan's challenge is demographic, and if it can somehow solve that problem by immigration, Japan is going to be a contender, but I don't think they're there yet. Russia, another interesting case, because I was in Moscow recently and talking to people. They are okay for China to challenge the United States for now, But the moment China talks about hegemony, dominance, the Russians are very uneasy. They think themselves as hegemonic power of their own. And that they have no interest in transferring this struggle that they have with the United States, now potentially with China. The Russians will probably join hands if there is a major conflict among China, Russia, etc. But the problem is Russia's rise, Russia's resurgence will also be affected by China's ambitions. So if China demands too much and if the West is willing to renege Russia, Russia could also change positions, by the way. Russians could become like China of the 1970s if things get really out of hand. It may not happen. So a marginal economy like Russia will have little to contribute in a Chinese-led system. And so what kind of status, unless they decide Russia will build weapons, China will build economy, but that hasn't happened yet. So Russia is a questionable potential ally, and I think it could happen as a result of certain Western behavior towards Russia. ASEAN is where China has any hope of developing what you call these soft bandwagoning states. So China is doing very well with this wet strategy, with a couple of them at least, and that's where the East India Company idea comes in. You may know that within India, for instance, when the British came, they only had pockets of control, basically 4 cities. Today's Calcutta, Madras, Bombay, Surat, places like that. And they were able to expand through wet strategy, sort of divide and rule, go and try to fight one prince against the other, and one prince will join thinking he will get more out of this coalition. So that kind of the strategy of with Cambodia and all that. But the problem is the Southeast Asian states have to completely rely on China. Considerable economic dominance has to happen. It may happen because of the negligence of the West and especially the United States. But I think the fact that there is a Japanese economy, there's an Indian economy, there is even Australia, there are all kinds of options exist for these other states, make it very difficult for China to unilaterally become the overwhelming dominant state. China has a number of struggles in this process, and we need to look at what are the strengths and weaknesses. The upside of it is, if this BRI succeeds, it will be historically important because first time a rising power achieves hegemony through economic and other means, although it is not the first time because hegemony often starts with economic dominance and then military dominance slowly build up. Now, translating raw power to hegemony is an extremely difficult task. Often it is produced at the end of a war, and that is the problem. China has a couple of other big deficits. One is what you call the deficit in legitimacy. And so, in defining legitimacy, one can see that international orders created previous by hegemons create a kind of legitimacy. Legitimacy is a tacit acceptance of social structure in which power is exercised. That's Martha Finnemore's definition. A great power can gain legitimacy through multiple means. Common ideology is a powerful legitimacy builder, but is also difficult to replicate for most states. Stalinist Russia attracted allegiance from subordinate states due partially to ideology. Today's China's economic model, state capitalism, need not bring the legitimacy Beijing seeks. It is not an easy feat to mobilize people in different countries in support of a great power, even if the regimes want it, because the ambitions are not the same. Nationalism is a very powerful force. The European colonizers did not have to face nationalism because nationalism was not here. It was mostly some countries fought or empires or kingdoms fought, but episodic. It was not a unified challenge. China's other related weakness lies in the normative realm. The world community has little understanding of what China will do once it reaches dominant role. This attachment to Westphalian order plus Tianxia creates a confusion what exactly China wants to create. So how do you enhance legitimacy? So BRI actually is a very smart way to enhance legitimacy. But on the other side, China does things that make BRI kind of redundant in some sense. If China seeks hegemony, partial hegemony, or complete dominance, or will it behave like an aggressive rising power because it's going to be challenged by some other states? And this authoritarian state capitalism model, will it attract imitators? Although there is some tendency of what you call this contemporary challenges to liberal order. But my sense is liberalism is not over yet. If you ask people around the world, what do they want? Many of them will say freedom for choice. And that freedom comes not from an authoritarian model. Doesn't mean it's always linear way, but it could be still a long way to go. And liberal order has cycles. Liberalism can be challenged, but the next election or following one could destroy the whole Trump edifice with another set of ruling elite. You remember George Bush Jr. and then Obama came to the picture. So the question is, China needs to do a lot more if it wants to get there in a peaceful way. And it has to build confidence-building measures. It has to rise together with the potential other states. It has to re-energize BRICS or other mechanisms, institutional mechanisms, and create socialization of what it can do for these states as well. So let me conclude, because I think I've taken a bit longer than I expected, by arguing that China deserves a leading role in international order, but China should not push for hegemony of yesteryears. That concept is problematic because the 21st century should not be a century of resurrecting the old ideas of colonial European powers who destroyed themselves in the end, by the way, even though those who won, Britain, by the way, won, but where is it today? We know Brexit and all that. Economic globalization has deepened, and the resultant interdependence and dependence have increased. Military, especially naval competition, is increasing, but there is a substantial limits to what a navy can do in terms of pushing countries or this coercive diplomacy. Emerging order is diffused order with multiple power centers and coalition building. So we need to think about soft balancing the concept, limited hard balancing, diplomatic engagement, and I think the chief instruments of statecraft, how to deal with China in particular, will be changing as we speak. So my final sentence is that Beijing is well advised to return to peaceful rise strategy, relying on institutions, consultations, consensus, norm creation for its own sake and the sake of others. A benign multipolar order is likely to gain more acceptance among the principal states in the region, whether it is the United States, Japan, India, Russia, in which smaller states retain considerable autonomy. China has much to offer, but rushing to hegemonic offer status is unlikely to be a viable strategy for international regional order in the 21st century. Thank you very much.